Well, thank you, Marion and Jimmy, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Now, Jimmy, I'm not going to finish in 30 minutes, so I'm going to get going immediately. And I'm going to break two rules. Firstly, my Professor Lionel Opie is sitting there, and I'm going to be reading most of my talk because I've got so much information to get through. I have to convince you that what you've been taught for the last 60 years is rubbish, and that's going to take a little bit of effort. So I'm going to go very fast, and I will be reading, so I apologize there's no visual contact with you, perhaps. And so please understand, and the slides are available afterwards, so you can see what I've been saying. So in the interest of trying to keep to my time allocation, I'll be reading from the prepared text. That's not my preferred model, because it's such a complex topic that I have to address. Given enough time, that would be an easy task to convince you that I'm right. But to get through enough evidence to make you even consider it, I have to stick to my text. Even then, I'm going to be too fast, and I apologize for that. So to begin, for 59 years, we have been brainwashed by governments, by industry, by some NGOs and the experts to believe that a diet that is killing us is actually good for us. And the evidence that the diet is killing us is all around us, but for some reason we can't see it. Many of our parents have died from chronic diseases that our medicines have been powerless to prevent. Our children's generation is the most obese in the history of mankind, and our own health is not always ideal, and I'm the classic example. Despite eating the so-called healthy diet for 33 years, I developed adult-onset diabetes, even though I ran more than 70 marathons and ultramarathons in my life, and I continue to run on a daily basis 30 to 60 minutes. Why is it? Why did it happen to me? As one of the first proponents of the prudent diet in South Africa. So I began to question what I should eat when I first exposed to these books. Gary Taubes' book traces the changes in our understanding of nutrition over the past 200 years. It's an absolute epic book. Russell Smith describes what he calls the cholesterol conspiracy, and he calls it the greatest scam in the history of medicine. And Ben Goldacre looks at the pharmaceutical companies' influence on what we teach our students. I decided that what I had written in my book, Law of Running, was wrong. And 2 years ago, I said, sorry, guys, I'm wrong. And that's why we're having the debate. So, tonight I'm going to present 5 irrefutable facts to my knowledge are not taught at any medical school in the world. The reason they're not taught is because they're inconvenient. They require that we think differently, and that takes effort. Yet if these facts are true, then by ignoring them, we cannot arrive at a complete truth and help our patients. So my challenge tonight to this faculty is to ask this question. Do we teach all the facts and therefore have a chance of arriving at the truth, or do we delete that which is inconvenient? In which case, what we are teaching is a blind faith, i.e. a religious dogma, not a science. The choice, ladies and gentlemen, is simple, but the effects will be profound. My story begins 2.5 million years ago on the plains of southern Africa, where we meet Australopithecus africanus, a vegetarian who is 1 meter tall and weighs about 30 kilograms. Over the next 30 million years, this tiny vegetarian develops into Homo sapiens, a much bigger animal with a much bigger brain. The experts in our departments of archaeology and anthropology right here at UCT have been at the forefront of this research globally, and they tell us that this change came about because Homo sapiens became a meat and fish eater, and that it was these foodstuffs which allowed us to develop big bodies and big brains. This was achieved as humans became the best midday persistent hunters in the animal kingdom, able to run their prey to exhaustion. For those 3.5 million years, we did extremely well without being told what we should have to eat. So, the acme of human physical perfection was reached in the 1800s by the American Plains Indians, who at the time were the tallest in the world. Taller even than, as you can see from this table, than even the Australians, which means the Australians lost twice in 1 week, which is great. Now, but all that changed when the white man came along and shot out the bison and forced these Plains Indians, who were the most handsome and the most healthy people in the world, to eat the white man's diet with lots of cereals and grains and sugar and other healthy processed foods. And every year, millions of dollars are spent trying to understand what causes obesity. Well, it takes nothing to understand what causes obesity in these people. And this sequence is repeated all around the world. The 7th fattest nations in the world are small Pacific islands where people were profoundly healthy, eating the foods that were in their environment until they adopted the low-fat American healthy diet full of grains, sugar-laden box cereals, breads, and soft drinks like Coca-Cola and fruit juices. In all these countries, as happened with the Plains Indians, obesity followed immediately and diabesity within 10 to 20 years. Now, surely it doesn't require great intellect to work out what's going on. So where does the problem start? The problem starts with one man, Ancel Keys, who was a biochemist with ambition, who strayed into epidemiology. In 1953, he collected some data from the World Health Organization, and it probably took him 5 minutes to draw this pretty graph, which apparently shows a straight line relationship between deaths from coronary heart disease in 6 countries and the amount of dietary fat that they ate. What he failed to mention was that an association like this does not prove causation. And if you don't teach that to medical students, they will never, ever understand. But it was something he never understood. From this type of study can never prove anything because it cannot ever exclude that some other difference other than the one you measured caused the difference you found. Do we really believe that the only important difference between the Japanese and Americans is that the Americans eat more fat in the diet than the Japanese? But Keyes managed to convince us for 50 years that that was the sole difference between Japanese and Americans. Well, the problem for Keyes is that he was trying to fix a problem that did not need fixing. And you've never been told that because the rise in heart disease mortality had already reached its peak in 1953 when Keyes began his crusade. He should have been around in 1920 to make a difference because that's when the disease started rising. In fact, the dramatic rise in heart disease rate can be explained quite simply by the rise in cigarette smoking, which began to increase 1905, nicely 15 years before the rise in heart disease, as would be expected, as cigarettes take some time to cause health damage. So, sorry, where's the next one? Now, 2 American epidemiologists showed that Keyes had reported only 6 countries, not the 22 for which the data were available in 1957. They added in the 16 missing points, and the graph no longer looked quite so spectacular. However, they looked at all possible factors that might explain this association, and they concluded that, and I'm not going to read all the text because otherwise I'm not going to finish. But they described that there were many factors that had to be considered, and clearly, we'll read clearly, this tenuous association cannot serve as much support for the hypothesis which implicates fat as an etiological factor in arteriosclerotic and degenerative heart disease. And that paper is very difficult to come by, but it's one of the most important papers in epidemiology, but no one reads it. But their efforts were wasted as no one took any notice, and this classic paper is never read by modern scientists. Instead, Keyes acquired political support, and his ideas became the accepted truth. The theory was helped by the next man in our study, President Richard Nixon, who appointed Earl Butz, the Secretary of Agriculture in 1971, with the twin goals of making the farmers wealthy and bringing down the price of food. Butz decided that the solution was to industrialize the production of corn with the use of massive subsidies to farms. And this is the law that drove down the price of corn because this makes the subsidies to American corn growers of $5 billion a year. And that is why your Coca-Cola, which is killing you, is so cheap, because of this subsidy of $5 billion a year to American corn growers. But there has to be a market into which the corn could be sold, and this was conveniently provided by a Senate Select Committee, which under the chairmanship of Senator George McGovern in 1977 produced the first dietary guidelines which fundamentally changed our attitude to what we should eat. Until 1960, everyone knew that carbohydrates were fattening, and that is what would have been told at this medical school in 1960. That would have been what the teaching was. But these guidelines here, which were written by a vegan with no training in the nutritional sciences, now made carbohydrates the health food and demonized fat, producing what we call dietary lipophobia, i.e. the fear of fat. And many people didn't agree. Philip Handler, who was the president of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, asked this question: what right has the federal government to propose that the American people conduct a vast nutritional experiment with themselves as subject on the strength of so very little evidence? Because there was no evidence outside of Keyes's false information. And he went on and he said that it's not a scientific question. The dilemma so posed is not a scientific question, it's a question of politics. Those who argue either position strongly are expressing their values. They're not making scientific judgments because there was no science on which to make this decision and to change the nutrition of the whole world. And Dr. Ahrens, who is a highly regarded scientist who spent his life studying cholesterol metabolism, was exactly the same opinion. He said, it seems that the proponents of this dietary change are willing to advocate an untested diet to the nation on the basis of suggestive evidence obtained in tests of a different diet, etc. So there were people who were unhappy, and they were right, because 3 decades later, we know that Handler and Ahrens were correct, because this meta-analysis of published studies involving 347,000 patients makes this conclusion that there is no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with increased risk of coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease. That is not Tim Noakes speaking. That is a meta-analysis done by the experts. And what is more, the Cochrane organization, which is considered the most independent organization, say that there is no evidence that reducing the fat in our diet will reduce our risk of dying from heart disease. So the Keyes diet heart theory is completely wrong, just as the real scientists in the 50s and 60s said it. The challenge for this medical school that we either embrace this or we ignore it, and we continue to preach blind faith. And the choice is ours, and I'm only the messenger. Now, but we could have saved ourselves with 50 wasted years by simply checking what happened to animal fat consumption in the US as the incidence of heart disease was rising. And the answer was it was completely stable. And it fell afterwards. So the consumption of animal fat has fallen whilst the disease has been stable, and it didn't rise as it caused the disease. So animal fat has got nothing to do with the epidemiology of this disease. So the conclusion has to be that Keyes was wrong, and fat in the diet does not cause heart disease. The diet hypothesis is wrong. So the second irrefutable truth is this, that within 5 years of the widespread adoption of these guidelines, the rates of diabetes and obesity increased explosively in the United States. And so what happened was it took us millions of years to get to this beautiful human being, and within 28 years, that's what we sunk to. And the question is, how did it happen? And here is what happens. The diet comes in here at 1977, and these are the obesity rates in all groups in America. Relatively stable, and then they start to rise. And if you want to see it on this sort of graphic, the change in the size of these circles gives an idea of how rapidly this change is occurring in diabetes, in children who are obese, and adults who are obese. And that gives you an idea of how explosive this disease has been. And so what's the evidence? What has changed in the nutrition of the Americans to explain it? Now, this slide shows the men's, what they're eating between 1971 and 2000, and the same for women. And this number from there to there is the total calories, 2,500. This is the amount of carbohydrate, just over 1,000 calories. This is the amount of fat, and that's the amount of saturated fat, and the same for the women. So we look, and we see that nothing changes up to 1976, but why should it? Because the guidelines hadn't been introduced. So now they introduced the guidelines in 1977, and what happens? Well, the Americans do what they're told to do because they're compliant. They eat more carbohydrates. And what happens to the energy consumption also goes up, men and women, and it stabilizes thereafter. And the consequence is that today men are eating 6.8% calories more and men are 21%. But it's all in the carbohydrates. And why is it carbohydrate? Because carbohydrates induce hyperphagia, as I will show you. They're highly addictive substances. And they produce the hyperphagia, and that's what's going to happen if you make people eat lots of carbohydrate. So the conclusion is clear. The explosive increase in the rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes in the US have been caused by an increased carbohydrate intake resulting from the 1977 dietary guidelines. So now the third irrefutable fact is that we're not all the same. In particular, we're not all equally able to metabolize carbohydrate. Instead, some like me are completely carbohydrate resistant, and that's why we develop diabetes if we continue to eat this diet. So the presence of this genetic condition, carbohydrate resistance, explains why a large number of persons in predisposed populations become obese and diabetic when exposed to a high carbohydrate diet. Now, why is it that some people become as large as these gentlemen? And the answer is simple. It is that the homeostat which regulates your weight has got broken. And so people say obesity cannot be simply due to doing too little exercise, which is what industry wants to tell us, because they want to sell us more products, so you just go and exercise more and you'll stay weight. And that's nonsense, because we homeostatically regulate our weight, and we did so for 2-3 million years. In a homeostatically regulated system, any reduction in energy expenditure will be matched by an exactly equal reduction in energy intake. That's how the system works. That's physiology. Conversely, any sustained increase in energy consumption should be matched by an increase in energy expenditure. Hence, the problem must be that the homeostat has been broken by the 1977 dietary guidelines. So, this is one of the most important papers that I've ever read. And this tells us why the homeostat is broken. The authors began this study by screening 400 healthy, lean, sedentary subjects with a glucose tolerance test. And then they selected the 12 who had the best carbohydrate metabolism, and then the 12 who had the poorest carbohydrate metabolism, and therefore they called insulin resistance or carbohydrate resistant. They then studied the metabolic response of both groups when they ate 2 high carbohydrate meals, 55% carb plus a large sugar low. And this is what they found. Here they go the day, and they are given carbohydrates twice during the day. And this shows you the blood glucose response, and it's relatively similar, so it looks great because it looks the same. But when you look at the insulin response, it's quite different, and the people who are carbohydrate resistant over-secrete insulin. And that is highly toxic, as I will show you. What you will find, ladies and gentlemen, that this is a cause of Alzheimer's disease, it's causes of colon cancer and breast cancer, because they go with diabetes, and people don't understand that. This is where you want to look for disease problems, and they also accelerate aging. These all activate different pathways related to those diseases. So these people are carbohydrate resistant. They can't store the carbohydrates, so they over-secrete insulin. And the next thing they do is hypersecrete triglyceride. They produce too much triglyceride out of the liver, and they develop a fatty liver. And so with this little bit of carbohydrate, these people increased the fat content of the liver, and this is highly toxic. But it has 2 other critical effects. As your triglycerides go up, your HDL cholesterol, which you all know is the good cholesterol, goes down. And the other key is that the LDL particles, which we're going to hear more about, I'm sure, the small LDL particles, which are the real killers, rise. And so what we see here is a symptom complex in which you get hyperglycemia ultimately, you get hyperinsulinemia, you get hypertriglyceridemia, you get reduced HDL cholesterol, and you also get increased number of the toxic small LDL particles. And so the metabolism of every human is not the same. Those who have carbohydrate resistance are unable to metabolize carbohydrates safely. Now, if you look carefully enough, this is the metabolic profile with persons with carbohydrate resistance who ingest a high carbohydrate diet. They're all there. And I'm not going to read through all of them for the lack of time. But these are all the features also of the metabolic syndrome. So we can now begin to see that the metabolic syndrome, which we see in our clinics every day, and we don't know what causes it, is caused by a genetic disorder, carbohydrate intolerance, in people who eat a high carbohydrate diet. And I want to make the point, as someone who restricts their carbohydrates extensively, if you go 5 grams above the carbohydrates that your body can cope with, you put on weight and you get all these abnormalities. We're talking of 5 or 10 gram difference in your carbohydrate intake. And you only know that if you've been through the diet. Now, what's interesting is also, what are the blood risk factors for coronary heart disease? And they are not cholesterol and triglycerides alone. All these factors are linked to heart disease risk. But when you go to the doctor, what does he measure? He measures the total cholesterol, he measures the HDL cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol, and the triglyceride, and ignores all the other factors. And I'm going to show you that all these factors move together. They are not independent, they all move together. And so here we go. This is the traditional high-fat dietary hypothesis of Keyes. You eat a high-fat diet, that increases your LDL cholesterol, increases triglycerides, reduces HDL cholesterol, and somehow that magically clogs your arteries. And what we teach in medicine is that this is one disease, and these other diseases are different. They're caused by different things. Obesity, diabetes, hypertension, gout, metabolic syndrome, they're separate, distinct diseases. So you go and see a different specialist. But what if they were all caused by the same cause? Now, this is bogus because, in fact, this is what a high carbohydrate diet does, not a high fat diet. The high carbohydrate diet causes your triglycerides to go up. I've already showed you that. And it causes your HDL cholesterol to go down. I haven't showed you that. I'm coming to that. So this is completely bogus. The only thing that a high fat diet might do is to change the LDL cholesterol, but it can go up, it can go down, it can stay exactly the same. So this model simply doesn't work. It's not working. If the high-fat diet is killing you, it's not working through this method. So then let's go, and the next question we need to ask is, which of these blood factors is the most important in predicting our future health? Because that's the question you want to know when you go to see your doctor. This is the most recent study I could find. It's a study of 165,000 subjects, of whom 15,000 developed heart attacks and 5,000 had strokes. And these were the factors in predictive order: diabetes, age, current smoking, systolic blood pressure. And what are the variables we're debating tonight? They're right at the bottom. Right at the bottom. Cholesterol is almost without value, because this only means that there's a sort of 20% increase with cholesterol. Triglycerides, HDL cholesterol. The very variables that we doctors measure are relatively useless. But what's the factor that sticks out? It's a disease I've got, diabetes. So that's why I'm quite interested. So now we go and find out, what is it about diabetes that kills us? Because we know diabetics do not have higher cholesterol levels than other people. So it can't be the cholesterol. The answer comes from the European prospective investigation in cancer in 100,000 residents of Norfolk. And it was found that the blood glycosylated hemoglobin concentration, HbA1c, is the best predictor of heart attack risk. Now, this is there's a hemoglobin molecule that gets damaged when there's too much glucose circulating. So the higher the value, that tells us the higher is the red blood glucose concentration during the day. So what you see is these people are relatively normal, and as they raise their blood glucose during the day, the HbA1c rises. And if you have diabetes or very high values, most diabetics will have these values, your risk is not 20% higher, it's 700% higher. So this is where cholesterol comes. So that's the mortality. So this is where cholesterol comes in. That's predictive value of cholesterol. Which are you going to measure? Are you going to measure the HbA1c or the cholesterol? Okay, so, and the risk was independent of age, body mass index, waist-hip ratio, systolic blood pressure, serum cholesterol concentration, cigarette smoking, the history of cardiovascular disease. But obviously it's not the HbA1c that kills you, it must be the glucose. So let's look at the next study, was of 81,000 people in Denmark, and this was published early this year, and they had a random blood glucose measured many years earlier, and they were followed for many years until a sufficient number had developed heart disease. What they found was that in those with blood glucose, this is what they showed. If your blood glucose is 11 on that random test, so if I went and measured all of us, there'd be 1 or 2 people who are diabetic, they'll have a value of 11. This is what your cumulative incidence or percentage of developing an ischemic heart disease at different ages. And what you see is that if it's 11, your risk is very high, but if your glucose is 5, it's very low. And the consequence, this is for heart attacks. Now, what this shows, in essence, is that if you have a value of glucose of 11, at the age of 60, you'll have 30% of that group will have had a heart attack or some ischemic heart disease. But if you can keep your glucose at 5, you're going to get to 80 before that happens.
And similarly, as far as the heart attacks go, if you can keep your glucose down to 5, you're going to live forever. And I challenge anyone to come up with cholesterol data to show this, because it doesn't exist. There is no data. Because did you know that 50% of heart attacks occur in people with normal cholesterol? Did you know that? So what value is it to predict an individual? And you may want to know that the people with one of the highest cholesterols are the Swiss, and they have 1/3 the heart disease of the Americans, and the same with the Japanese. So what are we dealing with? Okay, and then finally, it gets worse, because even within the normal range of blood glucose, the normal range, this is the normal range of blood glucose from 2.8 to 4. If you had this value, you are amazing. I've only seen it ever once. And this is the value that we kind of take as normal when we see patients, 5 to 5.2. But already, of a value of 5.2, your risk has increased dramatically, and it's more than the risk which would be given from a high cholesterol. So therefore, glucose is the single most important predictor of your risk. And if you want to know how healthy you are, you need to do what I do. And I bought one of these little machines. Unfortunately, I haven't got it with me. And I measure my glucose every 6 hours, but I'm diabetic, so I need to. But the single most important thing you can do is measure your blood glucose. It is without a doubt that it's so important. Because if you want to really reduce your heart attack risk, you've got to get it down here. And there's only one way, ladies and gentlemen, you can get your glucose there. And we'll discuss that subsequently. So my conclusion is that abnormal carbohydrate metabolism explains why those with carbohydrate resistance develop obesity, diabetes, and coronary heart disease when eating a high carbohydrate diet. The second last point, I'm ignoring that. The fourth irrefutable truth is the following, and I didn't know this until I read these books. And sorry, the fourth irrefutable truth, let's go back to that because I got so waylaid. A high-fat diet reverses all known coronary risk factors in persons with carbohydrate resistance, whereas a high-carbohydrate diet worsens those factors. You have never heard that, and I will show it to you. And I wouldn't have known until I read these books by Jeff Volek. Jeff Volek sits in America, does the most remarkable work over the last 3 years, and he's written The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Diet and The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance. Remarkable work. This is one of his studies, and this was a study in which they placed two groups on either a high carbohydrate low-fat diet or a low carbohydrate high-fat diet, which is what I eat. This is the ketogenic diet with 60% fat. If you want to be thin, you better eat lots of fat, but no carbohydrate. Okay, so this was an energy-restricted diet, and these are the differences. No, you can't. You honestly can't, because this you can't. This is a 100-year debate. You can't. I'll be 5 minutes. Jimmy, you can't. Because you see, what's happening, it's censorship. No, sit down. No, it is. It's censorship. Because the whole point of my argument is coming now. So, no, honestly, you can't. Okay. But Jimmy, you make me worry. So I want you to look at the yellow bars, and the yellow bars are the goodies and the red bars are the baddies. And you will see with every single variable, the high-fat diet outperforms the other diet. This is the insulin reduction in insulin. This is the improved carbohydrate tolerance. Here's a triglyceride reduction. You want to reduce your triglycerides 60%, go on a high-fat diet. If you want, that's another one. If you want to increase your HDL cholesterol, the only way to do it is eat a high-fat diet. It's the only way, and you're never told it. This is the ratio. This is the small LDL particles, which are the killers. The only way you can reduce them is go on a high-fat diet. Doesn't work, a high-carbohydrate diet, and so on. Okay, so therefore, and do you think it's just me saying it? No, this is an analysis published this year. What does it say? Meta-analysis shows the data obtained in 1,104 obese patients showed the low-carbohydrate diet to be associated with significant decreases in every single risk factor for heart disease. What's more, low-density lipoprotein cholesterol did not change significantly. Okay, So, this is the reality. The high carbohydrate fructose diet causes all these abnormalities. And if you're not eating enough omega-3s and too much omega-6s, this is what happens. So there's one cure for all the diseases we treat at this medical school. There's one cause, one treatment. And you never got taught that. But that's the truth. Okay, now I'm finishing up. So the conclusion is a high-fat diet reverses almost all coronary risk factors. This is the converse of what is taught in all medical schools around the world, and you have to ask why. Okay, the final point is the one I've hidden. And this is why it's so important, because the 48,000-person Women's Health Initiative, of which my opponent was the project director, proves that the 1977 US dietary guidelines accelerate disease progression in persons with either known heart disease or diabetes. Thus, the landmark study, his landmark study, proves the evidence disproving Keyes' false dietary hypothesis. So here's the study, and there's his name. And this was the data that he had, and they randomized women to this group or that group. This group got all the advice, told what to eat. This group was told never speak to a nutritionist. And as a consequence, the subjects were followed. What happened? The study did not significantly reduce the risk of coronary heart disease, stroke, or cardiovascular disease in postmenopausal women and achieved only modest effects. But was that the only finding? But was that all the finding? That's the question. Because if you look carefully in the study, you find right in the middle, there's something hidden. And what was hidden was this statement here. And this statement said that the hazard ratio for the 3.4% of women with heart disease at the start of the study was 1.26. What that means is that people who started this trial with heart disease, if they ate the healthy diet, they got worse. They got more heart disease. That's what that trial shows. And this is entirely predictable as a high carbohydrate diet produces this condition in those who are metabolically vulnerable. Did the authors recognize it? Well, the head of the NHLBI, this lady, said, the results of the study do not change established recommendations on disease prevention. Women should continue to work with their doctors to reduce their risk for heart disease, including following a diet low in saturated fat. When the study had shown that if you reduce the saturated fat with people who have heart disease, they get more heart disease. So how could she say that? And Jacques, you also had some comments. And you said this study shows that just reducing total fat intake does not go far enough. But that's bogus, because the ones who reduced it the most got worse if they had heart disease. So that statement also doesn't hide. And then just to finish up, there's one sort of anomaly on the final table, on table 3. And if you look carefully, you'll see, I can't really see it from here, that this is, for example, the number of cases. This is the p-value of the interaction. And what this shows is that if you take statins, you'll notice there are no users and the users. And this is what there's no value of either doing it or not doing it. The risk is the same. But when you come down here, there's something missing on this table because there's no yes. There's no yes there. So if you read this table as it's published there, what you see is this tells us that if you have no heart disease at the study, you actually get worse on the diet. But that's not what was happening. So there's something wrong with the table. And what's wrong with the table is that there's a yes missing. And when you put the yes in there, at the bottom there, and then you drop these two lines down, then it says, if you have heart disease at the start of the trial, you do worse when you eat the diet, because that favors the comparison. You did worse. And if you had no heart disease, you didn't do any better. And to continue, from the Women's Health Initiative, okay, that promises 30 seconds. The Women's Health Initiative had also published on diabetes out 1 year ago, and they found that women with diabetes at baseline did experience adverse glycemic effects, and they said caution should be exercised in recommending a reduction in overall dietary fat in women with diabetes. What they should have said is you may not give a high carbohydrate diet to women with diabetes, because that's what the Women's Health Initiative study shows. So finally, the Women's Health Initiative provides the definitive evidence from a randomized controlled clinical trial that disproves the diet heart hypothesis. And following the 1997 US Prudent Diet Guidelines worsens the outcome of those who are the most vulnerable because they have either heart disease or diabetes. That's how I interpret that information. So my final conclusion of all this is that the diet-hard hypothesis of Ancel Keys is wrong. Its widespread promotion in the name of good science represents the single greatest error in medicine in the past 60 years. Thank you for your attention.